To understand the opening chapter of Wolfgang Iser's book on the fictive and the imaginary, we have to begin with the common sense view that fiction is simply whatever is not real. It is made up, fake, just stories. As Iser will remind us in later chapters, if we stick to this view of fiction, we might well be inclined to agree with Plato that society might be better off without it. But however common sense the idea may seem, the strict dichotomy of the real and the fictive doesn't hold up under much scrutiny. Consider the fact that we've all had the experience of reading one story that seems more realistic than another. Think of comparing Huck Finn to Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, both books by the same author, or even comparing the social observations of Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens to the wackiness of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, both books written in the same year. If we can say that one book in each pair seems more real than the other, yet each book is equally invented and made up, then clearly the fictive does not stand in simple opposition to the real. For this reason, Iser proposes a third term to create a triad of fictional creation, and that term is the imaginary. By the imaginary, Iser means all the potential outputs of the human imagination, which he lists briefly on page 3 as, quote, fantasies, projections, daydreams, and other reveries that ordinarily give the imaginary expression in our day-to-day experience. Iser makes the pretty safe assumption that all people engage in these kinds of activities, but acknowledges that, however wonderful the imaginary might be, it has two great limitations. It has no physical embodiment, and it has no inherent meaning. Yet, before you start thinking that Iser has just replaced the dichotomy of the real and the fictive with a different dichotomy, that of the real and the imaginary, be aware of the fact that for Iser, the imaginary is part of the real. After all, if everybody has daydreams and fantasies and everybody lives in the real world, then the imaginary must also be a part of that real world. Likewise, you can't point to the presence of the real or the imaginary within the fictive, because, as Iser points out, the fictive is entirely semantic, created in and through language, whereas the real is extra-linguistic, because it is our lived experience of the physical world, while the imaginary is pre-linguistic, because it is made up of the nameless thoughts and images that are always flitting through our heads. In that way, the fictive describes a special relationship with both the real and the imaginary. It can impart meaning, semantic meaning, to the wordless experience of reality, and it can give form and shape to the ephemeral workings of the imagination. If all of this sounds a little abstract, it is. But it has to be abstract because of a key insight that Iser had about the nature of fiction. Here it's helpful to think of a common expression we use every day in English classes, the work of fiction. We all understand what we mean by the phrase, and we might even picture the physical object of a book when we use it. But Iser's insight was that work is a verb as well as a noun. On page 5, borrowing language from the branch of philosophy known as phenomenology, he asserts that fiction is an event. It is a phenomenon that happens, and not an object or thing to which we can definitively point. That insight will have all sorts of implications for us going forward. At the most basic level, think about the relationship between events and the real. Because they happen in the course of time, events are always already inaccessible to us. But they have a palpable reality because of the effects they engender. I can never show you the event, the bicycle accident I had in second grade, but I can speak of it in language. I can show you a picture of a bicycle accident, and I can also show you my scars. The fact that events can be both fully real but also ephemeral is interesting in its own right. But when we turn to think of the particular events that are fictions, we begin to appreciate the relevance of Iser's theories to the practice of teaching literature. And that's because no two events are ever quite the same. In our old common sense view of fiction, behind the work of fiction stands an author who makes up the story and commits that story down in writing in a concrete, straightforward way. In this view, the reader's role in the creation of the text is so negligible as to be essentially non-existent. The reader understands the author's words, or not, but either way, the fictional work is still sitting there unchanged. By contrast, in Iser's construction, The fictive is an event that happens when there is an authorial act combined with an act of reading. The authorial act requires the creation of a text, which either further categorizes into three components: selection, combination, and self-disclosure. We'll talk more about them a little later. Meanwhile, the act of reading, well, it's so complicated that Iser wrote a whole other book about that. But in a nutshell, the act of reading comprises what we often call the interpretation of the fictive. It seems here like Iser is playing on the oldest, most literal sense of the word interpretation, which comes from two root words meaning something like to spread between. Interpretation denotes finding or assigning meaning to something, but as the etymology suggests, to find the meaning in something usually means filling in gaps and breaks in our understanding of that thing. For a fictive text, those gaps are precisely the other two terms of Iser's triad, the real and the imaginary. This is why on page 5, Iser says that the real and the imaginary, quote, form a background against which observation is to take place. It is as if what is present in the text must be judged in the light of what is absent. If this is starting to sound a little like interpretation requires reading what is not in the text, then good, you've been paying attention. This is what drives literal-minded people fleeing from literature classrooms. But let's start drawing them back in by thinking about how interpretation works from the reader's end, by returning to the first of the fictionalizing acts that form the core of the first chapter: selection. Selection is the act in which elements of the real world, elements which by themselves are disparate, random, meaningless, and therefore uninterpretable, are placed into the fictive world. As Iser puts the matter, the text deletes some elements of the real, extends the presence of others, and weights still others, so that we notice them more. These are, as Iser says, basic ways of world-making. Readers, by the very act of reading, assume that there must be reasons for why some elements are present, others are absent, and others are placed in the foreground of our image of the fictive world. Indeed, historically, readers have assumed that there is a single reason for why those selective decisions were made, and they sought for that reason by studying the mind and soul behind the selection of the text, the author. But the person of the author, the physical human who put pen to paper, is part of the real, and remember that that is extra-linguistic and extra-textual. So even when we try to find authorial intent, we are left again dealing with what is absent from the text. This is why Iser does not speak of a fictionalizing act, but rather fictionalizing acts, plural. Fictions are not made when authors write works, but every time that countless readers interpret texts. The same sort of process occurs for the acts of combination and self-disclosure. Combination is Iser's word for how the basic elements of the real are transformed within the text by linguistic, figurative, and literary play. You should be thinking here about how metaphors can change the meanings of even the most concrete words, and how rhyme schemes can enact similar shifts, as we saw in Iser's quote from J. Alfred Prufrock. Meanwhile, self-disclosure describes all the ways that literary texts participate in the conventions of literature itself: allusion, genre, meta-narrative, and so on. What Iser doesn't explicitly point out, but which underlies his whole chapter, is that as we move from selection to combination to self-disclosure, we are also moving on a continuum from the real to the imaginary. A work in which we most notice the selection of real elements, like most classic novels, from Dostoevsky to Hemingway, necessarily has a closer connection to the real. By contrast, works that are most upfront in disclosing their literary nature can also be the most dreamlike and fanciful, from Gabriela Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude to Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. But whether the fictive worlds lean more towards the real or more towards the imaginary, what doesn't change for Iser is the central role that the act, the event of reading, has in creating the meaning of those worlds. Each new reading of a text creates a new work of fiction. That realization can be very jarring for some readers, but in a literature class, especially if that class has many students who have been disenfranchised or silenced at various points in their lives, it can empower students immensely to highlight how much they contribute to the creation of fictive worlds. It can give them a stake in reading potentially any text and activate for them literary texts that might otherwise have lain dormant. And that is the reason why we have begun the semester with this difficult but essential essay on the fictive and the imaginary.